time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Niaz Dorry. Niaz Dorry is the coordinating director of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance. Prior to joining the Alliance, she served as the interim chief operations officer for the Healthy Building Network. She serves on the executive committee of the National Family Farm Coalition and Granite State Fish, and is a former advisor to Harvard's Medical School's Center for Health and Global Environment. Her fisheries articles appear regularly in the Fisherman's Voice and Samudra, as well as a range of other publications. And she is the keynote speaker at tonight's Community Alliance for Global Justice annual dinner taking place at University Christian Church. Niaz, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So start out, tell us about your organization, the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance.
Sure. NAMA, or Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, has been around for about 18 years. And the purpose of the organization was to explore new ways of managing fisheries and organizing fishermen. We felt that the old ways weren't working. We were losing ecosystems integrity. We were losing coastal communities. Fisheries management had become, and it still is, a very top-down approach to managing our fisheries and taking care of our ocean. And on top of it, it dismisses the fact that small-scale, medium-scale, community-based fishermen have an ecological role to play while feeding us at the same time. And so we felt it was time to change that dynamic. It was time to introduce a new way of organizing in fishing communities. It was time to shake up the fishery management process. And so we began to work in fishing communities. At the time, NAMA was actually created. I worked for Greenpeace as a fisheries and oceans campaigner, so I watched the development of the organization over the span of years. And when the position came up to be the coordinating director, it seemed like the right place for me to be, and stepped right in and found ourselves in the midst of working with communities all over the world at this point on policy alternatives that support small-scale, medium-scale, family-owned fishing operations that have the smallest ecological footprint, and market opportunities that support them and allow us to have our fish and eat it too, because a lot of times we find that fisheries, although we pretend to be killing them for the purpose of feeding people, we don't talk about fisheries when it comes to what is a sustainable food system. What does it take to look at fisheries through the lens of feeding people? Are we feeding people with it, or are we really just supplying the all-you-can-eat for $10.99, most of it going in the trash sort of a diet? And so we wanted to really shake up not only fisheries policies, but also the food system movements and conversations, and make them realize that the only thing we eat that actually has the word food in it is left out of our conversations all the time. And when we do that, we give a blank check to those who exploit the ocean to continue doing what they do. There's a lot of lessons that we have learned from the land-based food system that we feel are transferable to the marine-based food system that can make that industry much more ecologically responsible, and the food that they provide much more accessible to those who need it most, and not just those of us who already have options.
So what is community-supported fisheries?
Community-supported fisheries is a model that we adapted, obviously. We steal a lot of ideas, I have to admit. We looked at the land-based food system and thought, what helped the renaissance of family farms and small-scale farms over the past 30, 40 years since the farm crisis and industrialization of our farming and agribusiness takeover of our land? What sparked the coming back of the family farms? And community-supported agriculture played a big role. It began to put people back in touch with where their land-based food comes from. It gave farmers the opportunity to start reconnecting with those who eat what they grow and raise. And most importantly, it held them accountable, because now you're coming face-to-face with the people who are actually eating your food, and that gives you a different layer of responsibility. And we had also heard that community support agriculture was leading to a higher price, a better price, getting farmers to actually get closer to getting to parity when it comes to meeting their cost of operations. So we thought, what if we replicated that model and created community-supported fisheries? And that was the first one we created was in 2007, late 2007, in Port Clyde, Maine. And from there, we kept adapting the model and creating more and more of them. And today, There are nearly 50 community-supported fisheries around the world. The last one we heard about, actually, I got an email a couple of days ago from someone in London, UK, wanting to set up a community-supported fishery and wanting to have that support. We have a website, localcatch.org, that people can go and put in their zip code and find the closest community-supported fishery to them. But what it's done more than anything else is we find the small and medium-scale fishermen are really demoralized. They have constantly been told, you're doing it wrong. And we felt what the most important role community support fisheries have done is give them some hope, give them some love back from their community, that people do appreciate what you do. And when it comes to fishing, we'd rather see you succeed than the Tysons or the Caterpillars or the Conagras or the industrial agribusiness model that's been taking over the fishing industry rapidly over the past couple of decades. So it really provided that spiritual uplifting that some of these communities need to hang in there, not sell out their permits, not sell out their boats, and know that there is potential for another renaissance to happen, this time when it comes to our water-based, our sea-based food system.
So is the community-supported fisheries, is that similar to CSAs in which people pay ahead of time?
That's right. So with a community-supported fishery, much like you would go and pick up a box of veggies or eggs or cheese or whatever comes in your CSA, in this case, you pick up your share of whatever fishermen caught in your area. And one of the interesting thing about a community-supported fishery that more and more it's a challenge for a lot of folks, because we're so used to eating half a dozen species, and yet majority of fishermen aren't just catching half a dozen species. They're catching more than that, yet we don't accept that into our diet. And my opinion is, if we've already killed it, it's our responsibility to absorb it into our market system. And so in New England, for example, on an average year, there are over 60 species that come across docks in the New England region, yet the average chef knows about 10 to 12 of them. And so the benefit of a community-supported fishery is that mystery element of it. You don't know what you're going to get. For some consumers, that's a challenge. But for others, it's an experience. It's something that they want to explore and see what are the other species that we are catching. It is truly true that it takes an ecosystem to raise a fish. And so there's a lot of other things that swim with the species that are popular. And they come up in the nets and they come to shore, and fishermen get paid virtually nothing for them. And in a community-supported fishery, they're actually getting paid a good price for those species, which cost them the same amount of money to catch than the popular ones. But because there is no market, they're often thrown overboard dead. So I think it's our responsibilities as eaters, people who believe we should have access to seafood, to also take responsibility for all the other species that come to shore. And CSF gives people that experience.
So how do you encourage people to try out and consume the other 45 to 50 species that they aren't normally going to consume?
We've had to get creative about that. People are afraid. There is a little bit of an unknown element. What is it I'm eating? I don't know this fish. This fish looks gray. That fish doesn't look white enough for me. That fish the flesh is different. So in New England, we started these events we call seafood throwdowns, and we hold them at farmers markets. They're cooking competitions, and we invite local chefs, and we have judges, and we have an MC, and we focus on introducing people in those competitions to those species that they don't know. So it can demystify the process for them. How do you clean a fish? Do you have to always fillet it? No, I actually don't know how to fillet, and I don't want to learn how to fillet. And so teach people how to steak a fish, how to stuff a fish. And the chefs, when they arrive, they can bring 3 of their favorite ingredients, but when they get to the farmer's market or the food festival where we hold these events, we reveal the secret locally caught seafood, and we give them each $25, and they got to run around and buy the rest of their ingredients from that event. So it also helps people know that this is not a out of reach thing here. You can have a great meal of an unknown species and have the ingredients come from your local farmers and your local vendors. And this is easy to do. So we wanted to really break it down literally for people. And also those events give us about 2 hours of captive audience to talk about fisheries policies and what's happening, and for fishermen to actually come and see that people are excited about their catch and about what they do. And they also happen to be fun. We didn't want to, when I got hired, I thought, as an activist most of my adult life, the idea of tabling somewhere, I just couldn't handle it. And I thought, what if we created something that was less passive, and people couldn't help but come to the event. And so we literally spent weeks around my kitchen table with our farmers market manager in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and some other creative friends, and we cooked up this idea. Obviously, it's another idea we stole from Food Network and all these other cooking competitions, but it seems to work in this case where people are introduced to things they don't know, and at the same time, I jokingly say there's a subversive idea of having the policy issues come into that conversation, but it's a happy environment. People are willing to learn because they're excited by the competition element of it, and now they get to see the whole animal. And that's another piece of a community-supported fisheries, or the educational pieces that we do. We want people to know this is an animal. It has a tail, it has a head, it has a body. It's not just a unidentified food object. I call it, a fillet on a piece of ice. So it's really important for us to get back in touch with that and show people how do you scale it, what does it look like, and get comfortable with the fact that, much like a chicken, this thing is a real animal, and you need to respect it, and you need to also learn how to handle it.
And I saw with a video of you at one of the throwdowns, you had pointed out that when you fillet a fish, you're basically throwing away 60% of it. Is that right?
Yeah, there's an average of about 60% of the fish ends up on the cutting room floor. And some of the fish vendors and processors know what to do with that. A lot of them that have a fish store, for example, or they make value added to things like chowder, use a lot of those cuttings, but most of the time they don't. In Gloucester, we have Neptune's Harvest that takes a lot of the waste and turns it into fertilizer. So at least some of it is being used, but most of the time it isn't. And there's another issue, and I think from an ecological standpoint, if we're using the whole fish and we can reduce the amount of fish we waste, that translates into less fish that we have to catch to feed the market. So that's a really important element. There's also the nutritional element, and I cannot help but think that cooking the whole animal with all the connective tissues, all the things we take as supplements. We get fish oil, for God's sake, We take glucosamine and whatever shark fin cartilage I've seen even in supplements. And those are all the things that are already in the animal. So I think when we cook it, all of those nutrients. So there's a holistic healthcare person in Gloucester, and I was talking to her about it, and she said, I kind of agree with you. I can see how that would happen, where the breakdown of all of those ends up in our diet and in our bodies. And then there's another element, which I think when we cook a chicken on a bone, when you cook a lamb on a bone, and much like the same scenario exists, it tastes better. In my opinion, it's much more moist. It's you're getting the full flavor. So if you're eating seafood for the sake of the seafood and all the nutrients and the omega-3s and the good fats that are in there, cook it whole. Keep the bones on. Don't feel like you always have to just have a fillet. It's really not that difficult to steak a fish or to cook a salmon steak. People are used to. But other animals that we get from the sea, to cook them whole or to cook them in some other way than just fillets, is foreign to a lot of people. So we spend some time teaching them that.
Talk a bit about Gloucester. What's it like there?
Gloucester, it's funny, there's a sign as you enter Gloucester, it says America's oldest fishing port. And I wish I could go and put a little, those little insert signs, America's oldest settled fishing port, because I think people forget that there were people who lived here way before Europeans arrived. Gloucester is an old fishing port. It has gone through many immigrant populations that have dominated the fishing industry there, the Irish, the Sicilians, the Finnish. And from a political standpoint, historically, economically, geographically, it's sort of been the center of fisheries policies, controversy, and also innovation. I feel a lot of new ideas come out of Gloucester, but we often dismiss them because we think Gloucester is one of those communities where exploitation runs high, and so we tend to do something that I feel we need to let go of is paint the fishing industry with a broad brush. We assume they're all rapers and pillagers, and we've decided to ignore the fishermen completely and lost touch with them. And Gloucester is one of those communities that I feel has been mischaracterized for the greatest part. Not that everybody in Gloucester is perfect, but much like the rest of the fishing industry or any part of our economy or even human beings, none of us are perfect, but we look at potential. And when I think about fisheries and seafood and who's catching it, I think on one hand, I can trust the fisheries to as I mentioned, the Tysons and the Conagras and the Cargills And the factory fishing operations, on the other hand, I can trust the fisheries to the equivalent of family farmers and people who are much more connected. And for me, it's a no-brainer. And that's the piece that I think we want people to walk away from, is there is a part of the fishing industry that we need to support if we want to continue tapping into the ocean for sources of food, sea salt, seaweed, whatever it is. And there is a difference between people who fish and people who extract seafood. And if we want to continue to eat seafood, it's our responsibility to support the ones who fish and dismiss the extractors.
So how much influence and business do the large industrialized corporations have there in Gloucester?
Significant, not just in Gloucester, but globally. Fisheries has been the old antiquated economic formula of high volume, low value, single species, lowest cost of production strategies is what fisheries have been based on. Much like make cars the cheapest way possible, and then we realize, wow, at what cost? Grow wheat at the cheapest way possible. What costs does that come with? When we applied that formula with agribusiness to our land, we saw degradation of our soil. We saw degradation of rural communities. We saw the value of our food decrease, and we started to realize cheap food comes at a really high price. And those who advocate for that low value, high volume, economically efficient, so-called economically efficient fishing industry are dominating the political system, they're dominating the market, and marginalizing the small and medium scale fishing operations. And so most of our work involves bringing other players into the field, those who have paid attention to the breakdown that's happened in the banking system, in the healthcare system, in the educational system, all these systems where lowest cost of operation has entered the picture, and then we lost our money, we got sicker, our education degraded, we lost our homes, and now we're seeing the same policies be applied to the ocean, and I'm scratching my head thinking, have we not learned anything? So it's really important to know that those elements exist in Gloucester, in Seattle, in fishing communities everywhere, and we have to separate the two. We have to realize that we need to isolate those who want to replicate the same mistakes we made on land, on our banks, in our housing, and replicate it on the water, and support those who are coming up with new economic strategies, new fishing opportunities, new business models, and really shifting fishing from that high volume, low value operation to low volume, high value operations that are respectful of the ecosystem, which includes the communities that they live in and also feed.
Here in Seattle, we have a local fisherman icon, Pete Knutson, who you actually know. And he has pointed out on previous interviews that, it is a major battle just to be able to sell fish from his boat at Fisherman's Terminal here in Seattle. Is that the same situation where you're at?
Same situation. I'll give you an example. We have worked in the past few years with the city of Boston. Much like many coastal communities, I was surprised to find the ordinances that prohibit the sale of seafood. And in Boston, you couldn't sell seafood on public property, or if you did, it couldn't be when other foods were present. So you couldn't have a fish vendor at a farmer's market in Boston, for example. And so we worked with the Sustainable Business Network of Massachusetts, which is an affiliate of an organization that used to be here, Valley Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And we worked with them on their first ever Boston Local Food Festival. We really pushed the city gently to reconsider. And 2 years ago, we celebrated the lifting of this ordinance. At 70 plus years, in Boston, you couldn't buy local seafood on public property. So we celebrated it with 6 farmers markets in Boston, bringing local seafood 2 years ago. Last year, it increased to 19 farmers market, which for you guys here in Seattle, where you have seafood in your farmers market, you may be thinking, what? You couldn't have seafood in your farmers market in Massachusetts and Boston, sort of the icon of seafood industry. But it took some struggle to actually change that ordinance. In the Outer Banks of North Carolina, again, another place where fishing is a way of life. You couldn't sell seafood. You couldn't have something other than a fish vendor that has a brick and mortar facility to be able to sell your catch. Portland, Maine, similar thing. So these ordinances in some cases were put into place in to protect public health because they were concerned that seafood could spoil or people didn't know how to handle it. But, we handled it well for many years before. And so part of me thinks, is it really a public health issue, or is it a way for some folks to carve out the market and really dominate it? So I think in some communities there is an earnest concern about public health, like Boston. So we were able to show them we're not going to kill anybody. And we know the procedures, and the fishermen we work with know how to keep fish safe and in good condition. And so that's why they lifted the ordinance. So I think it's a good example of how, if we approach something not from protest but from opportunity and from possibility, and work with them to show that people are interested in working out the challenges, you can actually create change. And I think Pete has shown that in their business, and others have in various parts of the coastal communities that we work with. And we readily share those experiences with others who are facing similar challenges, so they can lift similar ordinances that really don't make any sense anymore.
Are there any community-supported fisheries here in the Pacific Northwest?
There are a couple, but not very close to Seattle. There is one that I just recently heard about in Bellingham. And as I was mentioning earlier, there was a time when community support fishery numbers were small enough that I could rattle them off by name and who operates them, what they catch. But the numbers have grown, and I'm getting old, so my memory isn't as good. So luckily, there are others who are keeping that information, and I encourage people to go to localcatch.org, put in their zip code, and find what's close to them. Having said that, in Vancouver, BC, there's Skipper Otto's community support fishery, great family-run operation, and they have salmon, they have crabs, and probably other species that, like I said, I'm getting old, I can't remember. Further down south in Oregon, the Port Orford Ocean Resource Team runs Port Orford Seafood, and there's another CSF in Gibraltar, Oregon. But I challenge people in Seattle to take it on. See if you can create a community-supported fishery and show your fishermen some love back and give them a fair price, and introduce yourself to some new experiences. This is a community that I think would embrace such a concept.
What would be the best way for one to do that?
Well, they can certainly get in touch with us, and through localcatch.org, they can get in touch with the people who are managing that website. We have actually a community-supported fishery resource guide that we worked with National Sea Grant Law Center to put together. It is an ABC of how do you start a community-supported fishery, where do you even begin the conversation, what are the values and the principles that need to be embodied in this kind of a business model in order for it to meet the ideals that we have come up with, which is we hear a lot about triple bottom line businesses that are socially, environmentally, and economically sound. And with community supported fisheries, we've added another bottom line, which is food system. Because, like I said earlier, the food system conversations have excluded fisheries, and we felt we needed to explicitly state that we're not just doing this to pay fishermen a fair price, provide seafood to consumers at a fair price, to be socially responsible and environmentally have a smallest footprint, but to also make sure we have a healthy food system that includes our fisheries. And so they can start with that resource guide. They can start by sending an email through that localcatch.org, and then take it from there. And if they don't know a local fisherman, if it's a fisherman who wants to start one, we'll be happy to work with them. If it's a community person who doesn't know where to even begin and wants to connect with fishermen, we can probably put them in touch with some of the fishermen that we know as a start of the conversation. It's not a model that works for every community. We have over the years found that it was a good start to the conversation, of shifting the conversation actually and the dialogue. But in some communities, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. But we also recognize that a community-supported fishery, even the biggest ones, don't capture all of the fish that fishermen are catching. So we wanted to be able to use that market and that conversation to create a bigger market, and as a result, a bigger change. So since 2010, we've actually been working with the healthcare sector. We have a partner in Healthcare Without Harm. It's an international organization that works with hospitals and healthcare facilities, and we've been working with them to shift the buying policies of the healthcare sector so they can also start including locally caught seafood into their cafeterias, into patients' meals. And the significance of going beyond CSFs and incorporating some of these large institutions it's a huge shift. It's a game changer for fishermen to sell all of their catch at a fair price to an institution that appreciates them. But the healthcare sector has the history of using their market muscle to change policy. And so we're not just doing this work to push seafood. We're doing this work to change the mindset and then tap into that mindset to push for policies that are going to change the way we fish and the way we market fish and the way we eat fish.
4 minutes left. What is green seafood?
Green seafood is a confusing term, and there's so many certifications, there's so many lists, and I feel the public is almost bewildered by them. You know, do I buy Marine Stewardship Council? Do I use the red, yellow, green lists? And I think for the public who wants to start thinking about all of these issues, it's a good start to look at those lists and to consider those certifications. But it's also time to go deeper, because those lists and those certifications we're finding don't include some of the broader values we've come to realize are important when it comes to a healthy food system. Fair price, slavery conditions in our food system, the conditions of the community that fishing is happening in, that diversity of species, for example. A lot of those certifications and lists are very single species based, and we find that a fish that's on the green list 2 years later, it's on the red list. So we talk about applying your values instead of focusing on species or certifications or lists. If you've decided that it matters that who raises your chicken or your pig or grows your lettuce, or what are the conditions of those workers, are they getting paid a fair price, how is the environment taken care of in that process? If you've decided your values, how far did your food travel, that carbon footprint we are always talking about now. When you start laying out your values, when we began to lay out our values, we realized that those lists were good enough to start with, but we needed to go deeper. We needed to start broadening our horizons. And so we encourage people to stop thinking about which species and start thinking about how far did it come. Who is the fisherman? If somebody can't tell you where that fish came from, I would say don't buy it. Because we worked with one hospital in Massachusetts, for example, and we didn't want to overwhelm them by saying, you need to change everything today. So we said, we want you to do one thing different. Ask your vendor the name of the boat. They did. The vendor wouldn't give them the name of the boat. Overnight, they changed their vendor and went to a vendor who could tell them the name of the boat. That's so important, and it's a small step, but it's a really important one, because then when you know the name of the boat, you can tell, oh, this is a small-scale boat, a large-scale boat, an industrial boat. Can I get to meet the fisherman even if you don't? But at least you can get some personal relationships there, even if it's on paper on your computer. And that was an important indicator for them, that lack of accountability, lack of traceability of where their seafood was coming from was an indicator that they needed to change vendors. And they did. And a fishing boat actually out of Gloucester is now one of the main suppliers to Boston Children's Hospital. And that's the hospital that made that decision overnight.
So multiple successes in Boston.
Multiple successes, definitely. In fact, in the greater Boston area, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Boston Children's Hospital, Boston Medical Center, and a few other community health centers have really been leading the work on shifting. Kent Hospital in Rhode Island, for example. But the early adopter of this work, I have to give him credit, was Fletcher Allen Healthcare, an inland landlocked hospital in Burlington, Vermont. They took the challenge right on, and they began shifting their seafood policies to the extent that they could within their limitations. And they found, just on one element, their carbon footprint, they found that the seafood that was considered sustainable was traveling 15,000 miles to get to them. It was caught in the Bering Sea in factory fishing operations. And by making the switch, they immediately reduced within 1 year their carbon footprint of their seafood from 15,000 to less than 1,000 miles.
Well, with that, we're pretty much out of time. We're talking with Niaz Dorry. She is the coordinating director of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, and you are also speaking tonight. You're the keynote speaker.
Looking forward to being with the Community Alliance for Global Justice folks tonight.
All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.